just going to say this one more time. If you don't want to be recorded, just take the time now to turn your screen to black, take your video off, and also take your name off if you want to. And then when we get all of our folks signed on here, we'll go ahead and start. All right, it looks like the other room is with us. Sorry,
Oh, is it on?
okay, I'm gonna have everybody mute except for the people that are presenting, just so we don't get any random shuffling of papers or audio feedback. And also, we were just talking with the group of artists that's presenting tonight. They were getting warmed up. This is something that Kari taught me one time. When you're getting ready to talk, you really want to move your arms around and stand up, maybe stretch it out. So even if you're getting ready to listen for an hour, if you feel like you need to stretch it out, you can do that now. Yeah, Tony needs to stretch it out. It just makes, it makes the presenters feel like we're with them. Okay. So my name is Nathan Lynch. I am the chair of the ceramics program and the glass program here at CCA. And I will explain in a few minutes the presentation format. But before I do that, I have the opportunity to make our land acknowledgement, our CCA land acknowledgement here. So I'm going to go ahead and read this. California College of the Arts campuses are located on the Huichin and Yelamu, also known as Oakland and San Francisco, respectively, on the unceded territories of Chochenyo and Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who have continuously lived upon this land since time immemorial. We recognize the historic discrimination and violence inflicted upon Indigenous peoples in California and the Americas, including their forced removal from ancestral lands and the deliberate and systematic destruction of their communities and culture. CCA honors Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, here and around the world, and we wish to pay respect to local elders, including those of the lands from which you are joining us virtually today. If you are unsure of whose land you are currently residing upon, we encourage you to visit native-land.ca. Okay, so we have 3 artists presenting for tonight's edition of the BFA Thesis Conversations, and they're going to talk for 10 minutes each, and then we, meaning myself, Kari, and our guest respondent, our guest artist, Kathy Liu, will have a chance to ask questions of the artists. For all of the rest of you that are joining us tonight, we welcome your participation and additions to the conversation via chat. You can send them smiley faces and exclamation points and whatever else you want in the chat. And if there's a particular question you would love to have addressed, I'll try and catch it, especially if there's several on the same theme. So before I introduce the artists, I want to introduce Kathy Liu, who is with us tonight from Bemis Residency Center, right, which is in Omaha, Nebraska. And Kathy is a ceramics professor and a first-year professor here at CCA. She's also taught at UC Berkeley and Mills College, probably a couple other places I don't know about. Um, and we just had a ceramics conference up in Sacramento, and I think Kathy won the award for having the work in the most shows. Currently, she has a major installation up at the Chinese Cultural Center in San Francisco, which I strongly encourage you all to go see. And she's a finalist for the SF Mamasika Award. And Kathy just got a new job as a tenure track professor at the museum school in Boston. So thank you for joining us. Congratulations on your many recent successes. We're very happy to have you with us.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
So this is the order of artists' presentations tonight. Kiran, Sahgal, Tess, Aykanian, and Katie Buckley. Kiran is with us via some kind of orange screen in the Ceramic Student Lounge. You look great against orange, Kiran. And I'll just say a few words before, and then you can jump in here. Something happened during the pandemic where people, I realize we're still in it, but during the quiet part of the pandemic where the artists couldn't work in our studios. None of us could work here, which is frustrating for all of us, I'm sure. And one of the things that I noticed this year, because both of these artists that I've worked with have had their senior shows now, there's like a burst of energy that people came back to the studios with in a way that I don't normally see from the fall of senior year to the spring of senior year. Both Kiran and Tess had major, I don't know, breakthroughs, for lack of a better word. So I'm excited about that for both of you. I'm excited to see the shift in your work, and I won't say too much more than that, Kiran, because I don't want to spoil your presentation. But even how you put together a great show, I'm excited for you to share it with people. So go ahead, you can share your screen now.
All right, well, thank you for the introduction, Nathan. Let's get started. Let's see here. All right, everyone can see this all right? All right, hello, my name is Kiran Sahgal, ceramics major. Let's get on with it. I will start off by showing you some stuff that has inspired me and also talks about where I'm from, this being the mountains behind Ojai, California. I captured this image when back over winter break visiting family for Christmas, and it serves two functions. In one, I've always been inspired by the silhouettes of mountains even before I really wanted to pursue art, but this in particular, catching the desert covered in snow is always just a treat. On the theme of mountains and geology, these sort of caterpillar-esque textured mountains or hills are in the Carrizo Monument, National Monument, and I pass by them all the time, gone camping there quite a bit. So another thing that's influenced me visually over the years. But I currently live in Oakland, California, and the reason I'm choosing to show you the sort of more industrial side of Oakland is because that's sort of where I've spent most of my time here in the Bay. I've lived in and around the industrial zones for a while, so it's just core to my visual landscape here in the Bay, much different from where I grew up. Onto clay and why clay. It sort of started off with being mystified by this mushy material that you can kind of manipulate and transform into a usable object. So I started off with pottery and seeing sort of the endless potential for growth in that realm. But what really caught my attention and made me sort of stick with this is the firing process. I'm a bit of a pyromaniac, so putting, pottery that I enjoy throwing just for the challenge and the fun of it, but putting it into a box of fire and getting it as hot as I possibly can really sort of drew me in and gave me the bug that is ceramics. The part of the bug that really stuck the most in relation to the firing process is just seeing what happens when you melt all these different various powders and minerals and just sort of see what happens. On the left is a piece of quartz rock wrapped in an engine sort of refractory material made of basalt. So not to get too nerdy, but it was just things you're not supposed to put in the kiln that are fun to put in the kiln. But I just love the way the crystal growth and the movement happens and various ways applications. Some of these are from past works, some of these are from the series that will follow. But I could spend just a whole 10-minute presentation talking about all the little nuances of glazes and firing, but I won't bore you with that. Onto my influences on a personal level, I got to start with my mentor in ceramics, Mark Churchill. He was I did an apprenticeship with him in the end of high school. Two of his more, I guess you'd call simple forms, even though if you've ever made a moon jar, it's not a simple feat. But I've seen him throw these mugs on the left at a rate about 40 or 50 an hour, depending on how much he's in the zone. This piece of his is one that really inspired me to watch him make, both thrown on the wheel and added later, but still it's awesome to see him push himself a few years ago doing this series. Beatrix Wood and Otto Hino are two of the heavier hitters in the ceramics world from Ojai in particular. So I grew up seeing their work even before I appreciated who they were. And my mentor's mentor was sort of the younger generation interacting with these two around Ojai, California. Mike Nava is a painter I've interacted quite a bit with at the studio I apprenticed at. Just a great resource talking about art and different ways of making, different ways of thinking about color and such things. As well as Chris Churchill, my mentor's older brother, who spent a good bit of time in the New York art scene, another valuable resource that has influenced me in my early years of making stuff. On to people I don't know at all, but I've been influenced by. Tom Sachs is someone whose work ethic and dedication to detail is something I've really appreciated. This particular tea bowl is from a series called Tea Ceremony on Mars, and I really did enjoy all the little details he put into this show. Ken Price is someone that's influenced me, even though his sculptures are pretty legendary. His paintings, and particularly this series, This Is Tomorrow, is something that has influenced me for a long time. Just, I think, a beautiful series of work. And on to light and light art. James Terrell, got to tip my hat to this guy. This piece in particular, Gainesfield, I was lucky enough to get snuck in to this exhibit at the MoMA in LA when I was a kid. It was amazing to see. But yeah, it's really something I've been thinking a lot about this semester, even though my work's nowhere near Terrell's work. Onto me and more of what I've been doing. The pieces on the left sort of serve to represent where I was at the beginning of last semester. I was really still stuck in the pottery mindset, trying to figure out how I could make my pottery more sculptural. And what I ended up taking away from it was the shadows and made me think about light more. These pieces, I made these at the beginning of the pandemic. It just also serves to show how dedicated to function and pottery I was. Is when I was forced to hand build for the first time, I still ended up making cups, even though there's clay from my backyard and granite and all these different weird things. But at the beginning of last semester as well, I was in one of Nathan's classes and I had to make a sculpture to interact with, to stand on top of, and that's the table you see on the right in its unfinished form. And the reason I show you that is because this is really the first thing I hand built of scale. And its friend, the overhanging sculpture on its left, I made that just because I ended up having more fun making these sculptures than I thought I would, and had extra clay to make it out of. So I just made a second one, but I know what function would be, and that'll come later. Like I said, I was in the mindset of throwing things on the wheel, but I still ended up having more fun with sculpture than I thought I would. So I kept practicing sculpture, but in the effort of making pedestals for my pottery to sit on top of. And that's what I thought my show would be about. But this was just sort of an experiment, This piece, obviously very influenced by Nathan, just a blobby piece called The Spirit of Stickiness. It didn't end up looking sticky at all. So a little bit of a failure in that regard, but it was just a fun piece I wanted to make last semester. And back to that overhanging piece and sort of what this semester's work has been all about is I did a quick study with this. This only existed for about 5 minutes and really was like secured with a tiny little piece of leather. It was like really flimsy, but it was just served as an experiment to see how I could get this sculpture to provide light for something else. But then I ended up thinking about a sculpture that could provide light for itself, which brought me to my series this semester. So since I was having fun making sculpture and it was solidly outside of my comfort zone, I kind of just ran in this direction of making forms that with the goal of having them provide light for themselves primarily. Some detailed shot here of my desire to sort of still work my origins in pottery into this particular piece, where the rest of the series did not have as much traditional pottery involved. This one was called Escape the Blob. Just trying to, it was a pivotal piece in my mind of getting away from making blobs. Nothing against blobs, but I wanted to try to step away. There will be some moody photos to follow, but it's sort of in the spirit of a piece lighting itself. So these two go together, and here's the moody photo that follows. This piece I called Leaner because as I was making these pieces, I really was just making them all in a way where I wanted them to work, but I still was unsure about sculpture, about what the limits were of clay when it wasn't spinning. So this piece started leaning in one direction, and I had to make it lean in the other direction. It ended up kind of looking like a tube of toothpaste all smushed up to me a little bit, but it was a lot of fun to make the lampshades and practice my welding and, just try my hand in the metal shop, something I ended up also having a lot of fun with. This piece titled Not Red, it's red, but it's called Not Red. I don't know what you think about that, but still. I like this piece the most because it has these little details that do serve a function, being cones sitting on their own little pedestal, cone 10 and 11, just a measurement of temperature, something that most people don't usually get to see. And then also the little bit of red felt that exists at the bottom of these sculptures that are aesthetic choice on one hand, but also serve a function of making it easier for me to interact with these pieces and move them around in the world. For what next, here's a quick image of a very quick study I did. I made this thing in a day and definitely got some problems, but I will be continuing to make a few smaller series of lamps that are specifically lamps to sit on the desk. But I also have 4 pieces. I'll be showing you 2 of them here today that I did not get to finish the way I intended for my show. And I've gained access to a metal shop over in Berkeley, which I'm lucky enough to get to finish my pieces in. That will get done this summer. But besides that, just doing whatever I can to keep making work. I'll be living in the Bay, building out a studio at my house, as well as seeking employment in the arts or around the art world, applying to the Crucible, helping artists and whatnot. And just wanted to thank all of you for hearing my presentation. My email and Instagram is to follow, and the little photo there is just to show you the scale of the work. All right, thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks, Kiran. Very nicely timed, by the way. Let's see. I think, Kathy, I'm going to let you start us off since I know Kiran's work so well, and then maybe Kari and I can join in.
Yeah, sure. Well, Kiran, thank you so much for sharing your work with us. I really enjoyed your presentation. It was like, I just love the way it flowed. Explain like your background and where you grew up to like what you're making right now. Yeah, for me, I just thought so much about like, it was really helpful to see how focused you were on landscape, because I still see a lot of that happening now in your current work with the lamp forms, like just the way you make them. And I also really loved like how organic they feel and how they almost feel like small creatures too. Like there's a lot of movement to them, which is not something I would generally think of when I think of a functional object like a lamp. Yeah, I'm really interested in like your kind of this play between like function and sculpture, because I think you're approaching both with such play in a way where sort of like the categories don't really matter. And I wonder if that's something you think about, like if you're ever like, oh my gosh, the function is outweighing the form, or like the form is like distracting from the function. Yeah, I'd be curious to hear you talk about that with your process.
Well, thank you for the kind words. But in terms of how the function and form sort of balance out, something I'm definitely still figuring out. The function sort of acts as this like, it's almost smaller than it ends up being in my mind. It's more of just like an afterthought, or like a context in which I can rationalize my sculpture. And I think I've gotten a little more comfortable getting away from that now that the series is finished. And I have just thinking about things I want to make in the future. But it's not something I like strictly try to balance with my sculpture. It's something I definitely balanced in pottery and something I'm familiar with in pottery, but I just needed to bring that little aspect of ceramics and like that comfortability of function into it. So, you know, some of them actually that didn't make it into the show ended up not functioning because I built them in a way where they like moved in the kiln and you can't get any metal through it anymore. So it's something I consider, but it's also not like a very heavy-handed thought in my brain. It's just more like to make me feel like okay with what I'm doing.
Yeah, I really appreciated something you said, which was like making, sorry, I'm a little bit discombobulated, but it was something about how like making a sculpture to shine a light on something else. And then the thing that's shining the light actually becomes a sculpture itself. I love that in thinking about art too, because I feel like we always think about, you know, like the cable. It's not the art, it's just the cable that like provides the electricity, but it's not the art. Or like the lighting we have shines light on the art, but it's not the art itself. So we have this like hierarchy almost in objects or values and how we think of function. And I love that like with your sculptures, you're kind of like breaking all that down and putting it all together. I think it's super exciting place to be.
Well, thank you. It's also a nice excuse to like not get on a ladder and use a track light. You know, it's just like, I don't want to go on the ladder and figure out where they're supposed to point. Just like plug it in, it's done.
Well, I can keep talking. I don't know if other people want to go. I was also really curious too about your color, like how you thought about color, especially more towards the end when you're like incorporating more of the light bulbs, and just how like lighting changes color too. And I appreciated how you like were just super interested in the process, like just really excited to see like what happens in the kiln. But I wonder now that like, you know, you obviously have a lot of skill, a lot of knowledge, and like if there's certain colors you're aiming for, or like just how you think about that relationship, I guess.
With this series, I wanted to use a lot of copper red, mainly because in a reduction firing, if you can get a copper red to go red, it shows that it's like a mark that you did your job properly. It's like a mark that you actually succeeded in getting a proper amount of production, which was like a little challenge I wanted for myself, because I fired all the kilns with my work into myself. So it was just like, you know, that very like, you know, it's almost like I was like betting on my ability to fire a kiln and hoping that it would come out, and it worked. But color is something after this series I've really thought about a lot more, because in pottery it was just always like dip it in something and it's done and it's just the color of the glaze. But on one hand I like the controlled colors, but on the other hand I really do love the unpredictability of high fire ceramics. So color is kind of just like a little surprise for me sometimes. Like a glaze that's supposed to be green could turn orange if you do something wrong or right, depending on how you think about it. So color is certainly something I've been thinking about a lot in the, you know, for going forward. Gotten some critiques that my work is a little too shiny, so I might try to work around with some matte glazes. We'll see.
I think just to, Kathy, is it okay if I chime in here? Too shiny is something that we're always thinking about. Obviously, Kathy, you love it. Come on. Nathan just put a Southern Exposure piece in for the auction that's like way too shiny and awesome and just perfect. I think too shiny is a way to say, hey, look at me, here's your focal point. Here's what's going on. Yes, it's amazing. And with you, what I'm excited about with your progress is that you've taken on, and sorry, I am smiling. I just have a mask on. I'm really excited about the way that in which you have been thinking about environment and site-specific objects. They are lovely, and the quality of light is something that a friend once told me about, and maybe switched out a bunch of light bulbs within a household that I was living in because the light was so important and the quality of light was so important. And so I would encourage you to continue to explore that, and not just a James Turrell way, but in a way that is your own, to create the environment that you would like to from the sculpture that match and collaborate with the sculptures that you're creating. And that's what I'm interested in seeing next. And I'm already seeing from your pieces now.
Yeah, I'm also excited to play around with more different types of light sources. I barely scratched the surface. Like, everything that I use, you can pretty much find at Home Depot. Like, actually, you can find all of it specifically at Home Depot. So I'm happy to branch out from there in the future. I've already done too much research on LEDs at this point.
And you can do a lot.
That's
Yeah,
a good
sorry.
point, Corey, about the quality of light. And Kiran, I guess one of the things I'm happy for you about the work, the spot you're at right now, is that as you just said yourself, you've barely scratched the surface. It seems like there's so many directions, there's so much work for you to do, right? With it, it's like you got to this spot where there's a bunch of new questions for you to ask yourself. So I think that's a great place to be at this moment in your education, about like, you definitely know what you want to do next. Some of the other things that when I saw your presentation that I was impressed by was just the range of influences and the things that you gathered from them. Like, that was a nice list of artists that you referred to. By nice, I mean it had some range to it, and it wasn't just, you know, there was a number of people, and what the way you were thinking about them was interesting. The other thing I just want to comment about you as a student is that and an artist and a person, is that you're extremely open. And I think that's really going to serve you well as an artist, that you're a kind of a sponge. You say yes to people and things and techniques, and you're a helpful person, but I can also tell that you're kind of like gathering tools along the way, actual tools, technical tools. So I just think I'm happy about that, and I want to encourage you to hold on to that attitude of gathering as you go, because I think it's going to serve you really well.
Thank you.
And any other thoughts, Kathy or Kari, that you want to share?
I was just going to add to, I really appreciate the small details, like the little cones that were bent that were like part of the sculpture. The red fell at the bottom of your sculptures, or at one of your sculptures, I thought was really like my mind got all fuzzy. I was like, oh, that's exciting, you know? So I think, yeah, there's a lot of exciting things. I like to, I think it's exciting that you're thinking of things on like a larger scale, but you're still paying attention to all those little details. And yeah, I'd be curious to see like how I think light is such a weird thing to explore. So I think it's really exciting. And then actually going back to the shiny, too shiny thing, I think that also, maybe the light will help you like play with that too, because like the glazes and the surfaces will reflect light differently, and that might be interesting. Yeah, it was really exciting work to see. Thank you.
Kiran, the last thing, it just occurred to me, is now the show is over, you can really afford to slow down a little. I think in terms of when you can do that with the desk lamps, for example, and kind of pay more, because you produced a lot of work in a very short amount of time. Now that you have a little more space in your schedule, you could deal with things a little more carefully, like have a shiny and a matte thing next to each other, all the little details around the feet and the joints, and how the lamp shade connects to the metalworking, all those things I think you can attend to. Like, I like your pace, I think it's great, but now you can kind of breathe into it a little bit.
I'm gonna have to wait until summer to ease into that. I've a lot of my plate going into this next month. I forgot to say it in my presentation, but I'm arranging a group show with a bunch of us who are graduating this semester and next semester. It'll be May 13th. Feel free to come, everybody. That's but thank you all.
That's great. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Ava, how do we do a collective round of applause on this thing without asking everybody? There we go. I see some hands waving.
Can we just do a single clap, Nathan? Is that not a thing
Yeah,
anymore?
can you lead that for us? Can you orchestrate
Yeah,
that? Everybody turn their
anyone
mic on.
who's able to, can you turn your screen on? And can you watch my Tess? I see you, and I know you're upstairs. Can you put your hands here? Good, Ava, great. Okay, Tony, excellent job. Okay, now we're gonna clap all at the same time, just a single clap, because it's the most effective. All right, here we go. Kind of, and great job.
Moving on. Thank you for that. Thank you, Kiran. Tess, you are up next. What can I say about Tess? So Tess is our second artist of the night. Tess, I feel like I knew she was working upstairs all the time, but I didn't know exactly what she was working on. And I'm pretty nosy. I walk into people's studios and see what they're working on. I couldn't quite tell for a while what she's got going. And then this year she kind of like busted out in a new way. And so I just want to say to you personally, Tess, we've talked all the time, but it's really been a pleasure to get to know your work better this semester and last semester, and to see how you kind of grabbed onto some particular elements of your work and run with them a little more. Because I think you've grown a lot in the last year and been able to focus your attention on exactly what your interests are. So anyway, I'm happy for everyone to see more and hear more about you. And I'm gonna let you take it away now.
Thank you, Nathan, for the introduction. That was really sweet. Okay, great. So I'm Tess Aykanian. This is my BFA presentation. I am a ceramics major, visual studies minor. This is me in the ceramics building on the Oakland campus, a place that is really near and dear to my heart. I was born and raised in Los Angeles, California, and I lived there for the first 18 years of my life. And I started off kind of my personal practice by working on and observing the California landscape. I was really inspired by eucalyptus trees. I did a lot of natural dyeing with eucalyptus, and just looking at the patterns on the bark and the patterns on the dried Californian landscape. Half of my family is from the center of France, and I've spent a lot of my life kind of going and traveling back and forth to the center. And lately, the medieval architecture and kind of look of the region has been really inspiring. So for artist inspiration, this is artist Doris Salcedo. She makes installation and sculptural work that acts as mental and political archaeology. And I think what is really inspiring in her work is her amazing use of materials, from real plant material like those rose petals to the medical sutures and the fiberglass used on the right. And I think the use of these really insane materials kind of creates this mystery that I'm really intrigued by. And then Ruth Duckworth, really inspired by her ceramic work, and then this large scale ceramic tile installation. What's interesting about this work to me is I was doing a lot of work on the landscape and doing kind of traditional landscapes. And I think her use of almost abstraction and abstraction of the landscape has been very inspiring, certainly with this work. So throughout my work, I see time as additional adornment and not as a device of destruction. The cracks, tears, and degradation of an object act as further ornamentation and not the absolution of the original work and surface details. The weight of a sharp object on the human body and the acceptance of it creates scars that act like armor, both ornamental and protective. The body never forgets traumatic events or the conditions of chronic pain. My work is centered around creating and replicating painful objects of protection, taking inspiration from the natural world, cracks formed within the earth, the sharp edges of charred post-fire landscapes. And my deep appreciation for archival objects show them as repeating symbols and painted throughout my work. So I'm very deeply obsessed with archaeological ceramics. I think it's really interesting to see the way that time is shown through the surface details, the cracks, of the broken shards and then the way they're put back together. And this is a ceramic object from an archaeological museum from the center of France. So in response to this, I created a series of porcelain vessels, and I see kind of porcelain as the whitest, cleanest of the clays. You know, it has like the least amount of color and the least amount of grit. And so it feels like if I create something from it, it's like pristine and brand new. And then I used underglaze to make these cracks and kind of theorize what time will do to these objects. So these are 13th and 14th century metal herding dog collars. And these are very interesting because they look so painful, and yet they're used to protect the dogs from the bite of wolves. And I think that idea is so interesting. And these shapes and kind of painful spikes are really intriguing to me. And so I've been making work that kind of tackles that idea and just tackling that form as well. And it has become a repeating imagery within my work. So the first iteration were these chains. They're these spiky chains that I kind of set up in a, like, I guess, traditional chain kind of jewelry way in the way that they're hanging. And I think the fluidity and mobility of their movement allows me to set them up in a couple different ways. So this is the first iteration, and then second way of kind of setting them up, I wrap them around my body, again, in this kind of like jewelry drooping way. And, you know, when I pull them out, the shadows casted are very intriguing and an additional aspect to the work. So more use of the dog collars. These are 4 ceramic collars that are pulling this weaving kind of up and out, and then the gravity of them are pulling them down. And this weaving in the center is jacquard weaving of palm frond, a dried up palm frond, and it's overdyed with eucalyptus. So another aspect of my practice is drawing for and looking at different textures that it creates, and also color. I'm not really attracted to color, so using transfer paper and laying them over drawings was a way for me to kind of play around with it without making something permanent. And so it allows me to do kind of different iterations and slowly add in color and get used to it. So this is a floor tile piece. I call it a blanket because the way that I kind of made it, I was thinking about quilts and the many squares that make up a quilt, and that it seems painful to walk on and just looks like a blanket, but you wouldn't want to put it on your body or go near it. And then that imagery of the dog collar comes back again. And then in the upper right corner, I have a callback to those porcelain kind of old pots. And then in the lower right corner is a drawing that I made. And I'm really interested in the square within a square, kind of like a portal or a window, or just a piece of paper laid over another piece of paper. So I go to antique stores and look at archives for images and found imagery. And this is a print of a woman. I'm not sure if this was a real person or just an image of someone, an idea of someone, and she's holding ribbons and something. And this is so interesting to me because I don't understand what she's doing, and it's so interesting. And so on this pot, in the 3 vignettes, I kind of theorized what the woman was holding and bringing back some imagery of time and the physical piece of paper that she was printed on. And then this piece, calling back to the spikes on those dog collars, kind of evolving into thorns, seeing the way spikes kind of act on handles supposed to be able to hold handles. What happens when you put spikes on them and you can no longer hold them with your hands. And then in the center, there's this 3D window that is looking into a landscape that is on fire. And this was kind of a callback to my work, to when I used to work on the landscape and post-fire, and I never really represented the literal fire. It was always kind of through post-fire landscapes. And so I thought that the color of fire was really interesting, and I had never really worked with that. So trying that out. Here's a detailed shot of that painting. Very interested in miniatures. And then been playing around with different ways of setting it up. If I can't hold the handles, something that maybe is something that looks like it can hold it for me. And so created these spiky handles that hold the work up. And then I'm working on this in my studio currently, trying to make a rock pedestal, this black mountain with little pieces of granite stuck onto it. And I've kind of left out a space for another one of those windows to be placed. And then I like making things that I can form and place and set up in a bunch of different ways. So it can just act as a sculpture itself, or it can be a pedestal, depending on what I want to do with it and what the space calls for. I'm going to Anderson Ranch this summer for a soda firing workshop. Very excited about learning about different firing methods and alternative firings. And that's what I have planned for my post-grad. So we'll see what happens next. And thank you all for listening. And I have my Instagram linked right there. So thank you.
Thanks, Tess. I am so excited to see that last piece. I mean, I think I'm excited because you've already started a new thing in a new direction since your show. I brought tears to my eyes. I was so excited. So that's one of the advantages of having your show earlier in the semester. And I'm so proud of you for like jumping on to the next thing, to find like seeing the thing that you're excited about and then diving into that. I think that's a great direction. And I hadn't seen that yet. That's fresh to my eyes. Anyway, I'm going to hand it over to you, Kathy.
Cool. Okay. Well, that was really exciting for me because I've like seen you around the studio, I think, but I've never really gotten to see your work that up close or in depth. And so that was just really wonderful to see all of the things you've been working on. You know, I think I had some like first thoughts when you were doing your presentation, and one of them was just like in talking about material and technique. I really love the way you sort of like very seamlessly moved between materials, like the weaving, the ceramics, the drawings. I thought that was really interesting and cool to see. I also love too, like the cracks and then the dog collars with the spikes. You know, it's kind of interesting to start off as like, okay, yes, it's like cracks on pottery, you know, in reference to like an archaeological shards or cracked ceramics. But then I thought it was really interesting to see how you sort of like took that initial, like kind of more solid or representational idea and like really kind of abstracted it. Like, cause the cracks would show up, you know, I think it was like the first or second image of your work. And then like later on, it was in one of your drawings, like layered in one of those drawings. And then the cracks for me started to become these like neurons or tentacles. Like it was interesting to see how they like sort of evolved from just being a crack in a piece to like almost like reaching out or trying to make a connection. I felt the same thing with the dog collars. Like it was also this like kind of very, what a weird thing. I never knew about that object. And like, it was really interesting to see how like the spikes would change based on the work that it was on, or maybe what you were thinking at the time. Like sometimes the spikes felt longer and kind of like more reaching out. And then sometimes they were like very short and pointy. So yeah, I just really appreciated the way you sort of took these like two maybe somewhat disparate like inspirations points, and then for me they sort of led to like thinking about connections and relationships. And I think that made a lot of sense, thinking about what you're saying about relationship to landscape, but also relationships to the body and relationships to like trauma or pain. I thought there was something like really like kind of poignant about them, the way they were like so small and fragile, but like really also reaching out and powerful and scary. So I thought that was like a really interesting balance. Um, and then, oh yeah, your portals, that was really exciting too. You know, like the portal, like the sort of like tiny miniature kind of like illusion type window and the pottery, I thought was really exciting. It also made me too, because my kind of more my expertise is in like Chinese ceramics, and there's actually a lot of like windows that they use in those ceramics as well, which you probably know about. Yeah, I don't know, I'm really excited to see like where these go. And I love too the sorry, I'm just like rambling, but like the little handles holding the pot too, I thought it was really beautiful the way you're just talking about how like, well, you know, obviously I can't hold this, or it would be difficult to hold because of the spikes. And there was also just something really strange and emotional about the way those handles were holding that pot. Yeah, I don't know, I'd be curious to hear you talk about like maybe like kind of the emotional aspects to the work too, like if you're, I mean, because I got a lot of emotion out of it, but I wasn't sure if that was your intention.
I think so. I think that even just like the reaction that you get from seeing the picture of the dog collars, it's very it's weird because you know what a collar is, and then when I kind of explain, or when you see that it's actually something of protection, it's very confusing. And so it's kind of that as an emotional reaction is interest in why is that so sharp? Why is that there? And yes, I think playing around with like putting it against the body, the physical body, like putting it on myself. And then I did that in front of my class with Nathan, and then seeing everyone else's reactions to that was really interesting. And then I hadn't really ever done anything kind of performance art type, and I think it's maybe not the route for me, or maybe not in that way. And so trying to think of another way that someone can get a reaction from seeing the spikes on a body and vessel body, you know, that has always been kind of, those have been kind of interlinked. So yeah, I hope that answered your question. Also, I don't know about the portals or windows in Chinese pottery, so I'm excited to look that up.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. No, yeah, again, I think the forms are really exciting the way you're just abstracting it. I thought that in itself became a portal for me. Yeah.
Is it okay to chime in now, Nathan? Okay, cool. Kathy, I really appreciate your comments, and it got me all excited. I'm writing like my own artist notes, by the way, on the side here. Tess, I think it was such a lovely presentation, and thank you for being so honest and forthcoming with us about what you're thinking about, what you're doing. It means a lot. And Kathy made me think about when when you spoke specifically about the collar as a form of protection, but it's also sharp, and it's protection and it's sharp, it's caring, and it's aggressive. There are all those meanings behind it, and I would try to own that within the visuals of the pieces that you're creating so that you can visually convey them to us. I really like how you're perceiving them, and I think it's really good. And to me, it seems like you have a lot of questions around transition. Here's what I wrote down: transitions and loss, landscape and longing. it's worth keeping going. I think you've done an amazing job pushing through what could be a very intimate moment, but you've shared it with us. It's very generous. So I would recommend that you keep going with that. And I literally have like just a list of words for you that I was hearing and I thought were really important to you in your practice, having had the pleasure of seeing you for a few years. So that's what I've got for you so far. And you can always ask me more questions, obviously. Nathan is going to say something more poignant, but that's where I was literally writing down words.
Like, I can't wait to see your list of words.
Oh, you're right here.
Yeah, I like the combination of archaeological interests relative to ceramics with danger, because I feel like in those collars in particular, we're trying to understand their history. And the same thought comes to mind when I see those little paintings, like we're trying to understand that narrative. So it seems like one of the questions for you going forward is how much you're going to reveal, like how much of that story are you willing to let us read in that window or in that object? And so far it seems like not a lot. Like if it's a percentage of the screen that's taken up, there's a lot of it taken up and we can't see too much. So I guess one of my suggestions might be to, without even showing it to an audience, to just play with the degree of representation relative to abstraction or the degree of narrative that you want to let go of or provide the audience. And in some cases, try going too far. Like what is the too far space feels like. And the minute, I think that, again, that last piece was delightful and I'm excited to see what you're going to make next. I mean that really honestly. And also just that these events, well, maybe this is, I'll save that last comment for the end, but there's something for you in those little drawings. And also I think Kathy's point about the way, it wasn't just that you made those wall hanging things for the spiky handles, there was something about this like weird, tender curling around moment. There's something that right there at that moment, the way those two things touch each other to pick up and revisit again. So anyway, thanks for your presentation, Tess. It was great to see.
Thank you.
Kari, you want to give us a new applause format or the same one again?
Should we try clapping all together now that we've done it just once?
Sure.
Sure. Okay. Are you ready? Okay. 1, 2, 3. That was pretty good. I heard some from the other room.
All right. So thank you, Tess. Our next artist is Katherine Buckley. And I just want to say, Katie's not, this is one of the great things about doing these events. And I have to say personally, there's a lot going on this semester. And when I said to the student artists that we're going to do this, I don't know that there was a round of applause about having to do these BFA conversations. I think it was more like a sigh, and maybe I felt a little bit the same way, but already tonight with the two artists that have presented, I've worked with them both closely, but I've learned something about them through the presentations that I didn't know before. And I guess I want to point that out for everybody because we added these conversations during the pandemic in lieu of having like an opening for your work. But we aren't having the same kind of conversation tonight that we would have if we were at your show, right? And it's not a critique. And so I'm excited that Katherine Buckley is showing her work tonight because I saw her show earlier in the semester and it was fantastic. And there could be any other senior in this group, but I'm delighted I don't know anything about Katie's work aside from what I saw, but the show was fantastic. And if I had gone to the opening, I probably wouldn't have had this kind of let into her process in the way that we're about to hear. So, Katie, I don't see you yet on my screen, but I know you're here.
I'm here.
There we are. Thank you.
Okay,
I'm going to let you take it away. Welcome.
great. Thank you. All right. So my name is Katie Buckley. I'm a textiles major. I was born and raised in Santa Barbara, California, into a family of creative people and educators. I've been making art since I was young, developing the love of fabric through sewing with my mom and grandma. My maternal grandma is a talented quilt maker and knitter, and on the other side, my Nana was a bookmaker and artist. These two women have been huge inspirations for my whole life and a big part of the reason that I am an artist and a maker. The first time I saw the textile studio at CCA, I felt this huge sense of belonging and curiosity. Over the last 4 years, my textile practice has developed into weavings that are rooted in the preservation of craft knowledge and weaving systems and structures. And here's some pictures of me at the top, my studio, and then working in the studio at CCA. And then on the bottom is a picture from the Marshfield School of Weaving in Vermont. So a lot of my inspiration has actually come from the people that I've learned from, the artists that I've had the privilege of being taught by at CCA, like Deborah Valoma, Josh Fott, Ann Wolf, and Marina Contro, as well as many others have been influential to where my practice is today. The idea of a weaving lineage is something that's been emphasized to me, that everyone who teaches you or that you learn from becomes part of your lineage. That's a big part of how I frame my knowledge. The resources I use to further my education come from open source weaving material that I get from found books or from websites and blogs that are created by weavers for weavers. Sites like handweaving.net, which is shown on the bottom, provide me with material that's accessible and something that I can develop into my own work. As for materials, in my practice, I focus entirely on natural materials. This includes the fibers that I weave with, as well as the dye materials I use. A big factor in what draws me to the natural is the tendency for those materials to shift through time and use. Because textiles are meant to be used when the natural fibers are worn away or the dye begins to fade over time through exposure to light, the textile becomes a record for its own use as well as the user's life. Most of my weavings use wool, silk, and linen. These yarns are my favorite for the different ways in which they absorb dye and for the unique properties that each individual fiber brings to the weaving process. I've also been learning about fleece to fiber production and processing wool to spin into yarn, which has become something that I think I'll continue to use in my practice. As for dyes, the natural dyes I use are mostly chosen for aesthetic or color purposes. These are all ways for me to create a weaving practice where I have control in the product from start to finish. So another essential material to my practice is the drafts that I use to plan out my weavings. A loom works in a binary system. Threads are either raised or lowered. There's no in between. This is a painting I made to accompany my thesis show that depicts a weaving draft. The notation along the top is a threading sequence for the warp. The small section in the top right corner, the tie-ups, is essentially controlling what groups of threads are raised together. And the vertical notation on the right is the order in which those sections are lifted, which allows me to pass the weft yarn through the warp, creating the woven structure. The structures in which cloth is made have become a big focus in my practice. How do these systems lend to the way we perceive or use cloth? How do they affect the ways that cloth change over time? I developed the drafts I use for weaving using a software called Fiberworks, then thread the loom and weave according to the algorithm that I've designed. So now I'll talk about my thesis exhibition, Structural Sentiments. This was a culmination of the work that I've made pretty much over the last 2 years. During the pandemic, I was weaving at home in Santa Barbara and the house where I grew up, and away from the community that I have here. I became increasingly interested in learning more about the structural aspects of weaving, focusing on developing my techniques as much as possible, as well as creating items of comfort that feel like they belong in a home setting. So this work is a result of that thought process and my own personal growth as a weaver. Because so much of my weaving practice is rooted in the idea of use, home end use, I created this installation to mimic a home environment within the gallery space, both to invite people in as well as to play with the idea of what it means to be making functional art within a gallery setting. I used the hardwood flooring to merge the home and gallery space as a way of calling attention to the importance of surrounding ourselves with handcrafted belongings. In this space was a rug I wove using a warp-faced structure called rep weave. That's the close-up that you see here. A bench I wove the upholstery fabric for, a book of woven samples that I made to explore a specific structure, and several other objects to emphasize the feeling of being in a familiar or familial space. This is an example of the objects. These are samples that I wove on an AVL loom, which uses a computer-controlled draft, and that controls your treadling, but you're still weaving by hand, which is different than how I normally weave on a floor loom. These pieces are quilted double cloth, and they kind of are already a squishy type of fabric. And I emphasize that by upholstering them in these frames to kind of play with the idea of sentimentality with hand-woven objects. Another piece I showed in my exhibition was this hand-woven yardage that I made when I took a class at the Marshfield School of Weaving in Vermont, which is a weaving school that's based in traditional craft. My experience at Marshfield was really rewarding. I spent a week there right before returning to Oakland after being away for almost 2 years, and was lucky enough to take the class with a CCA professor, Marina Contro, who I actually hadn't met in person until that class when we were both in Vermont. Working in such an intensive and focused way over the course of a week really helped me refocus myself and my love of weaving and craft. I wove this using hemp yarn and dyed some of the sections with goldenrod that I harvested from the farm where Marshfield is located, as well as dyeing sections with cochineal and using the natural and bleached colors of the hemp. The experience of harvesting my dye material made me start to think about how a textile could be made in a more holistic, full circle way, and how I can have my hand in the process as much as possible from start to finish. So I wove this upholstery fabric and created a cushion for my loom bench. The fabric I wove uses a crackle weave structure, which creates these sections of light and dark patterning. I was drawn to this structure for the way it appears worn or faded, but in a really precise way. This piece will be something that I continue to use as my loom bench, and eventually it'll wear in a more organic way as I sit on it to weave over time. This is again a way for me to emphasize the change in a cloth that happens with use. I'm interested in creating cloth and objects that have a functional purpose, and this was a step in that direction. Another weaving I showed in my exhibition was this weaving I made at the end of last year. This was a kind of a culmination of a lot of sampling and research I'd done into overshot weaving. The structure of weaving uses a thinner ground weft yarn to weave a sturdy cloth and a pattern weft which floats over, which creates long floats that create these optical patterns that you see. One reason I'm drawn to this structure is because the pattern weft could be completely worn away and the cloth would still remain intact. This weaving is made using a kind of algorithm which some weavers refer to as a GAMP, which has different sections of pattern that are made through sequences in my threading and treadling. Each vertical stripe in the warp has a corresponding treadling that's used in the weft, which overlap with the other sets of structures to create 36 individual patterns in the weaving, which I've somewhat delineated using stripes and bands of color. This weaving functions both as a decorative wall hanging and also as a sampler or point of reference for myself. This was an exciting challenge to see how I could push the overshot structures, some of which I designed myself and some of which were appropriated from historical weaving books or online resources. The overlapping of structures becomes a conversation between patterns and the weavers who weave those patterns. The most recent piece that I've been working on is a collaborative weaving with my friend and fellow weaver, Jordan Held. For us, this weaving is a way of creating a conversation between weavers, as well as exploring the possibilities that a loom can have. In weaving, a cross is made during the warping process that holds the threads in order. And we've taken the cross directly from the warping boards and put it onto the loom as a way of connecting the two looms together. So my warp is beamed onto her loom and vice versa. We're currently figuring out how the looms can be even further interconnected and trying to figure out a system where we can control each other's threads and harnesses. This is an opportunity we wouldn't really be able to access without a full textile studio, and it's kind of our way of commemorating the knowledge that we've learned here. After graduation, I want to continue my education in weaving, most likely by finding work study programs or residencies at traditional weaving schools, like the program that I did at Marshfield. As far as where I see my practice going, my main focus is kind of on creating a hand weaving business for myself, where I can engage with clients who have a similar mindset and focus on where their belongings come from. I've also been learning fleece to cloth production and would like to continue spinning wool to be used in my weaving. My long-term goal is to have or work with a fiber farm where I can raise animals to be used for fiber production as well as grow my own dye materials. I also feel like I will eventually want to teach weaving, the preservation of crafts, and continuing the lineage of weavers I've learned from is something that feels essential to my life. The support of the textiles community at CCA has been a really special experience, and I'd like to give a huge thank you to everyone: Deborah Valoma, Josh Fott, Ann Wolf, Marina Contro, Angela Hennessy, Richard Elliott, Danny Lopez, as well as all my friends and peers in the textile studio. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. I felt so deeply from that presentation the strength of your program and the people that you worked with. So that's a note to you and to them that you're doing a great job. And I love some of the language that you use around your work, the preservation, rooted, just the fact that you chose the word rooted to describe your interest in something is noteworthy. Rooted in the preservation of craft, that you talk about a weaving lineage, right? I can hear you talking to Deborah Valoma when you say things like that. And I like playing with the idea of sentimentality. You know, as I said, I thought your senior exhibit was really strong. And one piece in particular I want to point to is that the two kind of puffy weavings that you framed to suggest upholstery without being upholstery. And for everybody to notice that Katie, she didn't just frame them, she framed them and put them on a shelf, which made them extra sentimental. And the shelf was sentimental. And the shelf had a little railing on it. You know, it was like, you sort of doubled down on that idea a couple of times, which I really appreciated. And I'm going to put in the chat for you somebody to check out who's a woodworker in Pennsylvania. I think his name is Jim Christensen, but he goes by your old pal Jim on Instagram. And he's so obsessive about woodworking and the history of craft, just in terms of like, when you're talking about raising your own animals or something for the wool, that kind of obsession and attention to detail, I think you would appreciate. So I'll put that in the chat for you.
Thank you.
I'm going to hand it off to Kathy and Kari from there.
Yeah, Katie, thank you so much for sharing your work with us. I thought it was such a lovely presentation of your work. I am not a weaver, but I love the way you talked about it. You know, I loved how you sort of talked about it recording time also as like this kind of a storytelling element of passing down history, and that you're actively recording a story in a sense, like especially with your collaboration with your friend, that'll then be passed down to others. I thought that was like really powerful. And just in looking, just in looking at your weavings as well, especially when you showed the draft or the like, sort of look like a watercolor painting or a draft that you do before the actual weaving. And sorry if my terminology is off, like I don't know. But for me, like it felt so much like I was looking at a language, like I was trying to understand like Morse code. Like there's such a strong sense of communication, which I hadn't really thought about in thinking about weaving before. And I thought your work really is such a strong part of your work, that you're talking about stories and history and passing along that history. I was also really interested in like the actual patterns too, because I remember you said it was sort of seemed like it was also like focused on maybe like challenging yourself technically, but also like open source and also like historical patterns as well. And I was curious, like, yeah, I was just sort of curious about the patterns themselves, like what, like for, like, I don't know, just like kind of what they represent, or like what story you think they're telling or you want to tell with them, I guess, for a non-weaver like myself.
Yeah, I think in terms of the patterns and the structures that I use, a lot of them come from just kind of like a whole variety of sources, and something that's interesting about them is that there's specific patterns that have been woven like time and time again, and are kind of like the classic patterns that weavers will recognize and be able to like call out. And a lot of them do have names. Most of them have names, and they're kind of come from like, especially with the overshot one in that piece that has all the different patterns. Those are from like the 17 to 1800s in America. But they've just kind of been repeated time and time again. And like I said, kind of that conversation between the people who wove them 100 years ago versus me weaving them now, and like how that is still the same pattern, but creates a very different piece of art.
Yeah, that's so cool. It kind of reminds me of like time traveling. Like you're sort of like communicating, I don't know if that's a weird comment, but yeah, sort of like time traveling, the way you're able to communicate like the present, the past, and the future from all different like geographical spaces, I think is really powerful.
I love that, yeah. And then something to add again is that like there is so much information on about weaving online, and that's kind of, it's such a specific thing to like nerd out about, that I've gotten a lot of great information from like random people's blogs, and like there is so much information out there if you dig for it. And that's kind of part of what I love about textiles and like weaving in general, is like somebody will probably have put some information about it online, and you have to really dig for it.
Is it okay to interrupt really quick? I just love everything you're saying. And I know time is of an issue, and I just think you should go down the rabbit hole. You're so very smart, Katie, and you need to, I would love for you to go down the rabbit hole and find out those things that you're curious about. It's such a pleasure to have you in class all the time, because you bring up issues and concerns and topics that are important to you genuinely. And that's the most important thing that we're doing here, is researching what we're doing and then diving into how to convey our findings. And I really enjoy seeing your findings. And thank you for sharing that presentation with us. It's a great delight. And I know I've worked with you, but here we are. So thank you.
Thank you.
The other thing that I wanted to add is just, there's another former textile student, I think she was textiles, maybe community arts, named Sierra Redding, who's now a high school teacher in Arcata. And she's like the only high school teacher at the high school. And she's also raising sheep. Anyway, it's an alum who's a very energetic, like highly warm and enthusiastic person I would be happy to connect you to. And that's happening right now in ceramics, that we have some alums here working in the building as a way of celebrating the end of our time here. And I just want to remind you personally, because you were talking about a couple of like post-school opportunities, and remind everybody that you're part of it, like a network of alums who in general at large really want to help the next generation of artists along. And if you're like wondering what to do next, just ask the faculty, like tell them what you're interested in. I bet they'll connect you to 5 people who might help in some way. And this is, the next comment is really about the school, but I mean it as a compliment to you, Katie, and really to Tess and Kiran also. I feel so kind of renewed after sitting here tonight. I really mean that. Like I feel renewed in like the power of our school, that your presentation gave me a sense of like, of what we're doing here. You know, it's exciting to have a first year student and sort of break their brain for the first time. but it's also really exciting to have seniors who make this big leap and take some risks and discover something through the process of their senior show. And as I said before, we don't always get that from the show. So I really want to thank the artists tonight that put together these presentations, because we learned something a little bit different than we learned from your show necessarily. Anyway, and I felt that sort of a big impact of that from your presentation, Katie. So anyway, I want to thank everybody for being here, and let's just have a round of applause or a giant clap for Katie before we go. Kari, you're orchestrating this. Oh, we're all
Now it's full clap. It's full clap.
full clapping for everybody. So thanks everyone. Thank you for signing in. Thank you to the artists for being here. Really appreciate you sharing your work with us in this format. And if we can be of any help, reach out. We're going to sign off.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Good to see you.
That was wonderful. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy.
Bye. Congratulations, Kathy. It's good to see you.
Thank you.
Kathy, thanks for being here. Sorry, I forgot to thank you independently at the end.
No, it's so wonderful. Like the work is amazing. I'm so impressed.
Yeah.
Really am.
And I'm going to make sure to go see your show at the Chinese Cultural Center. And when you get done at the Bemis, come say hello